All right, so let's just take a few minutes because we're doing the branches of government. So let's just take a few minutes and kind of, before we get into the presidency today, let's take a minute and go over kind of the highlights of Congress, what we really need to remember about Congress. I found this sheet today, guys, that has like 18 total questions. It's like 9 from each unit. I think it's fantastic. I'm going to give that to you guys like the week right before the test when we do that other 1 week where we're like hardcore reviewing. And I found some better concept questions related to the presidency that we'll work on today. And I've got a nice argumentative one for Friday. So Congress, when we think about Congress, there's like those important clauses that we should remember. So remember that Congress has, of course, enumerated or delegated or express powers that we can find in Article 1, Section 8. Oh, I forgot. Well, I don't know what I did with it, but when I went to school today, I picked up my handy dandy pocket constitution, so I wouldn't be without it. Article 1, Section 8 is where all those, there you go, is where all those powers are listed. Yeah, I picked up my one that's signed by Denver Riggleman. So anyway, and those enumerated powers, things like the power to tax, to coin money, all those things that they didn't have in the Articles of Confederation. And then we also know that kind of one of their biggest powers is that implied powers, which comes from the necessary and proper clause, also called the implied powers clause, which is pretty much that end of Article 1, Section 8, which says that Congress can do things that are necessary and proper to basically implement or, to make laws, to make all these other things happen. And, excuse me, we discussed that the other way that Congress has really expanded their power a lot is through the Commerce Clause, which is regulating trade. And we mentioned how that they use that for like the Heart of Atlanta case, which ended desegregated businesses. So those are the really big powers of Congress. We also talked about a lot of important checks that Congress has. So remember that Congress, of course, makes laws, but Congress also has some important checks. And everybody likes to mention impeachment and, impeachment and overriding a veto, but those don't happen that often. The ones that are really important is that legislative oversight, which is that ability to oversee actions by the executive branch, which includes the bureaucracy. Also the power of the purse, how important it is that they're the ones who actually control funding. And I would argue they're probably 2 of the most important powers that they have, and they're not one of the checks that we think about as kind of like the foremost comes to our mind. Also, when you think about all of that, like how they do the spending and funding, all those things are super important in the process of making sure that policy actually happens in our country. And of course, it doesn't hurt to mention too, the Senate's right to provide advice and consent, that they approve all of those appointments that the president does for the cabinet and for the Supreme Court justices and for all the other federal judges as well. All right, so I'm going to switch it over to the spotlight video, and then I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to look a little bit into the presidency. So where would I find the presidency? Where would I find that in the Constitution? Article 2, so Lucy eats, Jolly Ranchers, and Cook's Rats, so legislative executive. So when we think about our big ideas, which is the presidency has enhanced beyond its express constitutional powers. So we think about how that the presidency started and then kind of where it is today. And we know that a lot of that expansion of power happened due to personalities and events. So like FDR with the Great Depression, Lincoln with the Civil War. And so all those things can have a power to that. Okay, so let's look at some of these powers that the president has in the Constitution. So veto, which literally in Latin meant I forbid. This is something that we got from the Romans. And we talked about yesterday how even the threat of a veto often can make sure the policy or a law doesn't get made. because it is so difficult to override a veto, because you need 2/3 of Congress in order to override a veto. A pocket veto, which is another type of the veto, is a little kind of not as common, but towards the end of Congress's session, they often are trying to get bills passed, and the president can not sign a bill. If he doesn't sign it within 10 days of when it comes to his desk and Congress has gone home, then that's a pocket veto. Treaties, we know that the president actually makes those treaties, but they have to be approved by the Senate. So a good example of one that did not get approved would be World War I with the Treaty of Versailles that Wilson worked so hard on, implementing different parts of his 14 points, specifically the League of Nations. And one of the weaknesses of the League of Nations, of course, was the fact the United States never joined because we never approved the treaty. He got very sick when he came home. He traveled the country trying to get the approval that he needed. But if you remember, the Republican Party was split when they voted that year. Wilson was a Democrat, and because of Teddy Roosevelt running on the Bull Moose Party, it split the Republican ticket, and so Wilson was elected president, even though he was a Democrat, and there was very much a divided government with Republican stronghold in Congress. President, probably his most famous formal power, of course, is commander-in-chief. And we talked about how that the president doesn't have the actual authority to declare war. That's given to Congress, but the president can make war for sure. And we can look at examples of that, like Korea and Vietnam, the Persian Gulf. All of those are conflicts that we were involved in that in essence are war, Afghanistan, Iraq, and that is because the president's moved troops. Now, there is a limitation on that, which came due to what was happening in Vietnam, and that was placed under Nixon, the War Powers Resolution Act, which means that the president can only move them up to 60 days. He does have to notify Congress when he does it within 48, 72 hours. And Congress often votes to keep them there. Like Iraq, Afghanistan, Congress voted to keep them there. It's not just the president re-upping them every 60 days. All right, continuing with that, the executive orders, a little vague in the Constitution. Executive orders have the force of law. And this specifically is meant in order to execute or enforce or carry out the laws that Congress has passed. But the president has used this. If he can't get legislation that he wants passed, he'll issue an executive order. And so we've seen that with every president. FDR did the most. President Obama got accused of doing a ton, but he didn't do any more than others. President Trump hasn't either. And so executive orders, remember, are only supposed to, they only have to be held during the time that that person is president. And sometimes they get renewed, sometimes they don't. Executive agreements is a kind of way around treaties, just like executive orders is a way around laws. But executive agreements really have often been historically more like trade agreements and stuff. Bargaining and persuasion. We would see this often with the bully pulpit, how that the president can influence in how he speaks. I think we've seen a lot of good use of that right now with President Trump having almost daily reporting and using that position as people are looking and listening to him. Signing statements. So remember that when a bill is passed into a law, that the president does not have the line item veto, but he can, or she can, maybe one day, issue a signing statement. And that signing statement basically says that, clarifies the legislation, like how that they want it interpreted because maybe it was a little controversial or something like that. Okay, everybody with me so far? Any questions? Okay. Hey, Katie. All right, so we've got our little, this is a little bully pulpit here. And of course, what makes this cartoon so great or so funny, I guess, is because of all the little tweets, right? The little, and definitely we're in a new age and President Trump has really made it, taken advantage of social media in his way that he is using the bully pulpit. So we think about communication technology, like that's really changed in the modern era. And remember that the president, because they're one person versus 535 members of Congress, the president gets listened to more often. And we talked about sound bites, how sound bites with the media, like it's become shorter and shorter. But when the president can take over the TV at any point, right, and just talk, like if you've been watching, you know, since the COVID, when he starts talking, all the TV shows go off. He is required to do the State of the Union address at least once every year. That is a constitutional requirement. We've had delays in that. It was delayed, you know, this year. So the bureaucracy, I've been mentioning this a little bit kind of as we're going, so I'll mention a little bit. Remember that the bureaucracy really is part of the executive branch, and this is how all these things actually get implemented and made into laws. And we have all these different agencies. There's some pictures down there of several different ones. And so this is important thing is the iron triangle. And so in the iron triangle, we've got interest groups, which are trying to influence Congress and bureaucracy. This is when we're going to pass that law, say, on requiring everyone to wear a mask. Well, how's that going to look? What's that going to look like? There's going to be interest groups on both sides, which are going to talk about how that is going to happen and why they're for or against that. If we do a car emissions, for sure, General Motors or whoever else will be there saying why this shouldn't happen. The Greenpeace will be there as an interest group to say why it should. And your EPA is your bureaucracy was like, well, this is what it would look like if it happens. And bureaucracy, and I keep mentioning these words, are so important because it's that bureaucratic discretion, how they're actually going to implement a law. And they do that rulemaking. And this is how everything happens. And so when Congress writes a law, they don't think about the actual implementation, and there's not all those details. That is done by the bureaucracy. And so the bureaucracy gets overseen through legislative oversight, and that can happen, of course, with the power of the purse. It can happen with specifically coming in, and we are asking, you know, what happens. President has the authority to appoint and also to fire those people. And there's been a lot of, you know, remember when we were looking at this, President Trump is not necessarily the trend. Maybe he could be for what comes after him, but he definitely is not typical for what past presidents have done, okay? So when we think about how do we hold the bureaucracy accountable? So for Congress, they have these formal powers, but that legislative oversight is that big one. The president, by issuing executive orders or executive agreements and signing statements and stuff, can also influence how those things. He also appoints all those people who are the head. Now, of course, the Supreme Court can at any point say these actions are unconstitutional. And so that applies not just to a law, but it also provides to president's action. Okay, so how are we thinking so far? So for the president is the big thing. President is the one who, when we think about the president, I think the thing that's really going to come is what are the checks on the president? How has his power grown? Because that's something we really look at. Do you remember what are some of the other reasons that a person like the president's power might have grown? Like I mentioned, like a crisis or a war. Just how laws have changed, like the civil rights movement, the way that Kennedy and then Johnson used those legislative, all those different things that FDR created, all those are examples of how we've seen an expansion. Even things like No Child Left Behind and all those kind of things, anything that we've seen an expansion of government, okay, where we see government stepping in more. All right. I'm going to share my screen here. I want to look again. We're going to look at a practice question here. Come out of this. Excuse me. Do we have any questions on any of this? I did want to mention, because I thought about this, that I didn't talk about Baker versus Carr and Shaw v. Reno yesterday, which were related to gerrymandering. Baker v. Carr is the one man, one vote, so that redistricting has to happen and has to be parceled out equally. And then Shaw v. Reno says that racial gerrymandering is not okay. So both of these have to do with gerrymandering. Baker versus Carr is specifically redistricting with like the number of people. And then Shaw v. Reno is specifically about racial gerrymandering. All right, in your presidency, we went over veto, pocket veto, executive agreements, which are like treaties, commander-in-chief, executive orders. President also has the right to pardon. Okay, it's one of his powers. We've seen some of that in a lot of states where they're letting people out of jail because they're trying to get a little more room, and COVID-19 has been spreading pretty rapidly in jails. Judicial appointments are going to be a whole lot easier when you have unified government, because if your Senate is not the same party as you, they're not going to agree with you very often. Okay, so Federalist 70 talks about the importance of a president, how the president needed to have enough power, but the president wouldn't be a king, because that's really the thing they're afraid of, right? They're afraid that they're going to get a king. 22nd Amendment, this limits president to 2 terms. You could technically serve 10 years. How does that work? Well, the best case example would be Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson came in, Kennedy died, he came in and became president. He finished out Kennedy's term, then he ran for president, became president. He could have run again. That would have given him a total of almost 10 years. He decided not to because of Vietnam, but he would have still been okay to do that. Okay, we talked about the bully pulpit. It's really that. I would say that the president, when you think about agenda setting, how does the president set the agenda? Well, he does through the bully pulpit. He also does through the State of the Union address. Even his budget, right? The budget tells us what the president is thinking. These are all ways that the president helps to influence and make policy, because the president, remember, can't make a law. The president can ask a senator or a member of Congress to propose a law for them, but they themselves cannot go. Versus, here's a comparative one, Mexican president can actually make law, but the United States president cannot. Okay, remember when we were comparing those two, that the Mexican president is more powerful. So when we think about also that the president has a lot of power in appointment, because the president not only appoints the heads of the cabinet, but he appoints the heads of all those bureaucracy. He appoints ambassadors. Like, there's a lot of people that the president appoints. It's a lot of power. If you are an average citizen working for the EPA, your job's going to be safe. Okay, so we think about, remember the Hatch Act and the Pendleton Act, that merit, your jobs are based on merit, okay? Versus the guy who's the head of the EPA, or Dr. Fauci, we talked about yesterday, the head of the CDC, they can get fired pretty easily on the whim of the president. And so because they're appointed that. But your average civil servant who works for the government, their job's pretty safe no matter who the president is, okay? Because they're experts in their field, right? And they tend not to be partisan, because what's more important to them? The issue that they're working for with whatever agency that they're working with, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, you want to try a concept question? So, I thought these were great because they're all about Corona, right? So we'll start with that. All right, this is taken from the New York Times. Remember that the concept questions is always going to ask us, it's going to give us a scenario, and then it's going to ask for, like, what can the president do? What can Congress do? Okay. We currently do not have a full understanding of the spectrum of illness from COVID-19. I don't know when this article is dated, it doesn't have a date. Meaning we don't know how often the disease will manifest as a mild, severe, or fatal disease. Since we haven't yet been able to do surveillance testing in American communities or even some patients in hospitals, mild and moderate cases are being missed. Even so, Dr. Anthony Fauci, head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, recently suggested COVID-19 may be 10 times as lethal as the flu, even for young, healthy adults. In her presentation, Dr. Alter emphasized that for reasons not yet understood, infection in certain patients, particularly the elderly and those with chronic medical conditions, can result rapidly and unpredictably in severe lung inflammation called acute respiratory distress syndrome, which can cause a cascade of organ and system failures. Well, isn't that happy? Okay. After reading the scenario, describe an action that the president could take to address the problem described in the scenario, as well as the constitutional provision that would authorize the action. All right, let's start with, what action could the president take to address the issue. So the issue is the concerns about the spread of COVID, right? And it says specifically, since we haven't been able to do surveillance testing in American communities. Do you see that as that's the problem? Is that what you identified as the problem? That we don't know how exactly it's been spread and we're not able to do surveillance testing. Okay? All right. So you're the president. Congratulations. Okay? You've just been elected. Electoral College has placed you. We've got President Dills, President Duncan, President Sear, President Vaughn. Okay? All right. What are you going to do? What action are you going to do to address the problem? Who's got an action for me? Give me any action that a president can do. Tell me something that the president can do, and then we'll decide if that would fit in this scenario. For example, the president can issue an executive agreement, which is like a treaty. Is that going to be effective in this scenario? No, right? What treaty is going to help them right now? Okay, nothing's going to help them do that. Okay, so what else can the president do?
Executive order.
That's going to be your go-to, okay? So the president could issue an executive order that would allow for surveillance testing to get a better understanding of COVID-19. Where do we find this in the Constitution? I would accept for this answer if you just said Article 2, okay? All right. In the context of the scenario, explain how the Constitution limits the president's power to address the problem. What could be a limit on that? Okay, when we're thinking, how do we limit president's power? What did I tell you is the most powerful things that Congress has? Legislative oversight, and what was the other one?
Laws or making.
They do make laws. What about power of the purse, right? So he's issuing an executive order that says that we're going to do surveillance testing, right? How are we going to fund that? Where's that money coming from? Congress, right? So that's a limitation because Congress is going to fund it. Another limitation, let's say that he's doing surveillance testing that is in violation of HIPAA, which are your health privacy rights. Then the Supreme Court would say that's unconstitutional, right? Okay. So are those acceptable things that are limitations? Because we can't override a veto, right? Because it's not a law. So you got to think about your limitation has to be relevant to whatever power we're talking about. Okay. I'm thinking maybe we should like make a little chart that says power, like Congress, power, how that power is checked. Okay. President power, how that power is checked. Like if I said commander in chief, checked by War Powers Act, right? Also by power of the purse, right? Because we don't have to fund the military. Okay. I think that's maybe something that we should work on. All right. Maybe we can start that. We'll see how much time we have to do this and we can start that. All right, in the context of this scenario, explain how the principle of federalism affects the president's ability to respond to the situation. All right, I'm gonna give you an example here. You guys, were you alive when Hurricane Katrina happened and hit New Orleans and Louisiana? If you were little, right? You don't remember it. Okay, Hurricane Katrina comes. Hits Louisiana. President Bush could not give help to Louisiana until Louisiana what? Asked for it. Okay? Because of federalism, okay, the state has to ask for help. So, for example, when we declared a national, like when we declare Virginia as a state of emergency, that then opens us up to get some federal aid. But we have to declare those things and we have to ask for help. okay? So like when Secretary Carney the other week was telling us that they're getting the 66 million from the federal government, they had to ask for that. They just don't get it. So a lot of the complaint, because historically, I don't know what you know about Hurricane Katrina, but it was a hot mess, okay? And everything was just handled poorly. The mayor of Louisiana didn't ask the governor for help, and then the governor delayed asking the president for help, and then FEMA, the Federal Emergency Medical Assistance, mucked everything up when they got there. So help was delayed because the state didn't ask for help, okay? So when we think about federalism, we think about the president's ability to go into these states. Remember that a lot of this is up to the state. So like the state would have to allow like the federal agencies to kind of come in and do some of these things. The state doesn't have to allow some of these things, okay? And so the governors, we have to look at the governor's authority. Like right now, the president is saying we should open these things back up, but what does he also keep saying? But I'm leaving that up to the governor's discretions, okay? So he's remembering how important federalism is, that balance between what happens as a state versus national authority, especially when we're talking about something like this that's a state of emergency or is affecting particular states, because it is different, like what's affecting different areas. Like some people have been saying that Virginia maybe should open up by county. Like Fairfax and Henrico, it's horrible up in Northern Virginia, like the number of cases compared to the cases here. And there's even some places in Virginia that haven't had any cases at all, okay? So when we think about this, the principle of federalism, so when he starts going into states, that can, you know, we have to think about that, how that might affect, okay? With me? Okay. All right, this one's a little bit longer. I'm just gonna read kind of some sections because I think we can get the idea because it's a lot similar. Republicans are joining Democrats in growing backlash against comments from President Trump's Monday asserting total authority over deciding when to lift stay-at-home orders implemented by governors to combat coronavirus spread. When somebody's the president of the United States, the authority is total. This is from a couple of weeks ago when President Trump said this. Trump said during a raucous briefing Monday night as he was pressed on his claims that he could overrule local officials in reopening businesses and schools. The comment sparked an immediate outcry from the president's critics, who said it was another example of Trump's disregard for constitutional limits on office. New York Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo chided President Trump for acting like a king, but those critics were also joined by some Republicans. So Mark Rubio also commented on that, as well as New Hampshire Governor Sununu, okay? And then Maryland Governor Hogan. I think individual governors who make those decisions will have the ultimate decision about what to do with their states, okay? After reading the scenario above, describe an action the state governors could take if President Trump chose to reopen the economy as described in the scenario above. So if the president says, let's say the president comes on the news in the morning and says every state must reopen, what could Governor Northam do? Could Governor Northam keep Virginia closed? Yes, okay. He could refuse to comply. Okay, do you remember the Civil Rights Movement? Do you remember Little Rock 9? What happened? They had to send in the National Guard to get them to comply, didn't they? Okay, states have the right to refuse. If all the states refuse to reopen, the president could send in the National Guard. Like there's a lot of things that the president could do, but ultimately, there are a lot of things that Governor Northam could do. He could say, we're gonna reopen non-essential businesses, but schools are gonna remain closed. We're gonna reopen businesses, but they can have reduced hours and only 50% capacity. We can reopen restaurants, but they can only be at 50% capacity. So could they decide exactly how that open up is gonna look? Sure, okay, the governors still have that power in that, okay? President Trump can't say how Virginia is gonna work, okay? Like if President Trump had tried to close all the schools, can you imagine? The states would have thrown a fit, okay? President Trump actually has suggested that we reopen schools before the end of the year. Not going to happen. Okay. In the context of the scenario, explain how the action described in Part A might affect the cohesiveness of the Republican Party. So if the states decide to act against the president's order, how might that affect the Republicans? Why might the Republicans, how could it affect their coming? Do you think it would bring the Republicans together or it would divide the Republicans?
So,
yep, go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
So would it, I would think it would maybe divide them because the Republicans are all about the federalism and answering to the head government.
Okay, so remember that Republicans don't like big government and Republicans very much respect states' rights, okay? But yet, if you're a Republican, yeah, so if you're a Republican too, you're also supposed to be respecting the president. He's a Republican, right? So that's really going to divide your party if they're like, oh crap, we really do want the governors to do what they want, but yet we also want President Trump to have, that's going to put them in a very difficult position, okay?
Okay.
Yep. So, because the Republicans are very much, they want less big government. They want the states to make these decisions and things like that. Okay. But they're going to be divided because if you look back at those quotes, several Republican governors and senators and stuff support what the states are doing. They disagree with the president here. Okay. All right. So, if we look at Part C here, the 10th Amendment and the ideological perspective of the Republican Party with regard to federalism might be used to argue the governor's point of view. I think I just answered that, didn't I? So how the Republicans support states' rights and they want less big government. Democrats in general favor big government because they want to make sure that everybody's needs are provided and they think that happens through the federal government. The Republicans, it's more of that equality of opportunity. We're giving you all the same opportunity. I've heard a lot of Republicans who are very concerned about unemployment right now. So if you're not aware of how unemployment is working right now, I'll explain to you why this is a concern of theirs. If you apply for unemployment typically, so let's say that, so my brother, he's able to draw unemployment because his office is closed. So my brother gets paid an hourly rate. My brother sells tools, clamping tools, and so he also gets commission. So when they closed, they said, we will give you your hourly rate, but we're not going to give you what you get for commission. If your job is 100% commission, like you sell cars or something, then you can get unemployment based on that. Typically, when you get unemployment, you only get a part of what you normally make. You don't get the whole thing, and you have to be out looking for a job, okay? So because of the coronavirus, they are saying you do not have to look for a job, A. B, we're going to give you the full amount that you normally would get, okay? Now in Virginia, unemployment is taxed, or not taxed, but it's taxed by the federal government. So my brother is being smart and having money taken out of his check, so when he has to do this on his taxes next year, he won't owe. And so my brother also, though, the federal government also is giving every single person who's getting unemployment an extra $600 a week. So this is why people who work at Walmart are saying, I could go on unemployment and make more money than I currently do at my job. So when the government, when it opens back up, and what the argument is, people are making so much money on unemployment, they're not going to want to go back to work. Okay, but the problem is if my brother's business opens back up and he still has a job, if he doesn't go back to work, he can't continue to get unemployment. Okay, but the nice thing for my brother is because he's getting the extra $600 a week, that pretty much covers what he normally would have been getting in commission. So my brother is financially doing fine. But when you think about this, an extra $600 a week, that goes pretty far. Like he lives in Christiansburg, right? Goes pretty far in Bedford. That pays my rent for the month, you know? Versus if I lived in Northern Virginia, that $600 doesn't go as far, does it? And it's the same across the nation. So it's interesting how that's working out. But can you see how Republicans, their fear is that people are not going to want to go back to work and are going to want to be dependent upon the government. Okay. All right. So the 10th Amendment, remember, reserves power for the states. Okay. So in the case of like a state emergency with a health crisis like this, because it is so different across the nation, governors should be able to decide what's going to happen in their own states. And Republicans would respect that because of their belief in states' rights. Okay. Like, for example, Clarence Thomas, Supreme Court Justice, arguably, possibly the most conservative or one of the most conservative justices on the Supreme Court. When marijuana is brought up, he says, I personally disagree with the use and legalization of marijuana. However, if states want to legalize it, they have the right to do so, okay? Because he believes in states' rights. And that is an important Republican concept. That's where libertarians and Republicans very much agree, okay? So think about libertarians. Libertarians are socially more like Democrats, LGBT rights, all those things. But economically, they're more like Republicans, and they very much want a government hands off. They want even less of it. But that, they're definitely going to agree more with the Republicans, okay? You guys follow me on that question? Okay. All right. I think we need a chart. Don't you think we need a chart? Let's do a chart. New document. We got like 15 more minutes here. All right. Let's do insert the table. Okay. So let's do the branch powers, checks on those powers. All right. Congress can make a law. Okay. What's a check on that? Veto. Why don't you guys unmute and shout some things out? Okay. All right. President. And then, so if we say Congress has, we were talking before about executive orders, right? So what's the check on an executive order that we mentioned? Power of the purse, okay? So funding for the whatever you want to do. Possibly legislative oversight once it gets going. And possibly what? Judicial review, correct? With me on all those? Does this make sense? Okay. All right. Which, what else did we mention as a power? What are some other ones that we're talking about as a power? So Congress can make a law. Let's do judicial branch. Judicial branch, their big power is judicial review, right? So how can Congress override that? What could they do? So Congress can start an amendment process, right? We talked about that yesterday. What can the president do? Not enforce it. Perfect example, Brown versus Board of Education. When the judicial branch said segregation in school is not equal, how long did it happen? 1954, everybody changed. No, right? President had to send in, we just talked about Arkansas, Little Rock 9, right? President had to send in troops, okay? So my favorite, Jackson, my favorite quote by him, when, the Supreme Court made a decision, he said, good luck enforcing it, right? The Supreme Court has no right to enforce, they can't enforce it, okay? They can't make policy, they can't enforce policy, they can only judge policy, judge laws, judge executive orders, okay? So the president could choose not to enforce it. Do I need to put an example? Would that be helpful to have an example beside it? Like if I said like the civil rights movement, would that help you kind of think about it? Okay. Okay. So check on that power, but also keep in mind they can, you know, override a veto. So the president, so let's do, all right, there are other powers. They can do impeachment, right? Legislative oversight, power of the purse. They can approve treaties. So what would be a check on approving a treaty? That would be if the president did an executive agreement instead, or a way around it. Okay, make a law so the president could veto it. He could also issue the executive order. Well, I guess we'll leave that as a separate thing. All right, so approved treaties. What else do we have? Cabinet and judicial appointments. It's all those appointments, anybody who's the head of an office, okay? Remember that. We think about the president, he also has the bully pulpit, agenda setting. If I put State of the Union, SOTU, will you figure that out? Okay. It's hard without verbal and facial cue. All right, I'm gonna put bureaucracy as like a sub branch. It should technically go under the president, right? Okay, and so they have the power, we would say, rulemaking and bureaucratic discretion. Okay, and the power of the purse and legislative oversight would be the ways that those get checked. Obviously, judicial review too, if they totally overstep their bounds. But those two are the biggest ones, okay? Does this help? Like thinking about, because you're gonna have to say, tell an action, right? So if we said powers, actions, okay? Commander in chief. So like a limitation on that would be war powers resolution. Power of the purse, if they decide not to fund it. And any presidential action that they feel like is breaking a law, of course, would be impeachment. Another check on the judicial branch is the Congress can create lower courts and increase number of justices on the Supreme Court. I'm gonna call this powers and limitations, okay? Limitation / checks. So like what, because this is your concept question right here. What action can Congress take? And then the next one is usually like, how can everybody respond to that? Okay. So this is the power and action. This is usually part A on the concept question. Okay. And then usually there has to be like, what could somebody else do? What do we not like? Whatever. A lot of times the check or the limitation, this is B. Sometimes it's in C. Okay. So Congress is in Article 1. The president is in Article 2. And judicial branch is in Article 3. I'm going to also add on here just a like Commerce Clause, how that's a major power, right? And we're talking about powers and stuff, and then also the necessary and proper clause. Okay. And then all those enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8, like declaring war. Okay. Do you notice there's a whole lot less checks on Congress, right? Because Congress is very powerful, but there's 535 people there to stop them from going crazy, right? Judicial branch, they can also be impeached. Okay. How do you feel about this chart? This good? Helpful? You guys are so quiet tonight. All right. So in classroom, I created this little thing that says stuff that can help you during your AP exam, right? So let's add this to it. All right. So that's there. And then whatever else you might want to continue, we can think about, we need to do something with the foundational, with the court cases, right? We need to do some kind of little thing. If I gave everybody and said, because there's 11 of you taking the exam, I can be the 12th person because there's 14 of them. So if everybody took 2, and I can take more, and said like, this is the constitutional aspect, this is what it said, is that doable? If I make a sheet like that and give that as an assignment for everybody, and I'll put your name under it, and then we can put that in there as a workable document. Okay, I'll do that and I'll add it in there and send out a notification that says I put it in there, and that if everybody can work on doing that. And that doesn't have to be done this week. That'll be something that we work on next week, because next week is civil liberties and civil rights. And those court cases are super important for that. Okay. So I'll make that as an assignment for next week. Okay. All right. President, powers, checks, bureaucracy. So tomorrow's judicial branch, not tomorrow, Friday. We're going to meet Friday at 2. Is that what I said? 2. Thank you. We're going to meet Friday at 2, and we will discuss the judicial branch. We will do a practice argumentative essay with the presidency, and then we will go from there. Okay. We're going to do our big practice with I think the argumentative essay, I really think it's going to be like judicial branch, civil liberties, civil rights. Like that's my gut feeling. I could be completely wrong, but that's what we're going to practice. Okay. And the concept, I think it's going to be something like, I like this concept with the president and Congress and checking each other and all that stuff. And whatever they do for the argumentative, like it's going to bring back that unit 1, the democracy and those principles and stuff like that. That's what I love about civil liberties and civil rights. Like that is that early stuff too, right? It all kind of comes together.